The world is full of stories, some forgotten, some untold, and a few that changed lives forever. This is one such story, a story of fate, kindness, and transformation. It begins on a busy street where an 8-year-old girl, innocent yet wise beyond. Her years unknowingly altered the destiny of a powerful man. A man who had everything, money, fame, power, yet something was missing in his life. And it took a single moment, a selfless act, to change not only his heart, but the hearts of millions. Edward Marshall was a name known across the corporate world, a billionaire, a tycoon, a man whose business empire spanned industries. He was respected, feared, and envied. But beyond the shimmering skyscrapers he owned, beyond the luxury cars and private jets, he was just another man lost in the endless race for success. To Edward, life was about numbers, profits, losses, stocks. He had no time for emotions, no time for kindness. To him, the world was a battlefield, and only the strongest survived. Then there was Lily Thompson, a little girl whose life was the complete opposite of Edward's. She had no wealth, no fame, and no power. What she had was something money could never buy, a heart filled with kindness. Raised by her aging grandmother in a small town, Lily had learned early that life was hard, but that never stopped her from smiling. Even in her simple world, she found joy, feeding stray animals, sharing her food with neighbors, helping those in need. Her dream was not to own the world, but to heal it. Fate works in mysterious ways. On an ordinary afternoon, Edward and Lily's paths crossed in the most unexpected way. Edward was rushing through the streets, a man always in a hurry, always looking ahead, never noticing what was around him. Lily, on the other hand, was standing near a roadside stall, holding a small packet of biscuits she had just bought with her saved coins. What happened next would leave an entire nation in shock. A truck, out of control, speeding towards Edward, the sound of screeching tires, honking horns, and gasps from bystanders filled the air. Time seemed to freeze. The moment where life and death stood side by side. People saw the disaster coming, but no one moved, no one except a little girl. In a heartbeat, Lily threw herself forward, pushing Edward out of the truck's deadly path. The world watched in horror as the little girl fell to the ground. The billionaire, who had never needed help, had just been saved by a child who had nothing to give except her courage. The crowd gathered, whispers turning into cries. Who was this girl? Why had she risked everything for a stranger? As Edward looked at her unconscious body, something inside him shifted, a feeling unfamiliar, a weight in his heart. This was not just an accident. It was the beginning of a story that would shake the world, a story of redemption, generosity, and an unexpected bond that no one saw coming. Edward Marshall was not just a businessman. He was a force to be reckoned with in the corporate world. From an early age, he had one goal: success. He was born into a middle-class family where hard work was not a choice, but a necessity. His father worked long hours at a factory, and his mother ran a small bakery. Edward learned the value of money early, watching his parents struggle to make ends meet. He understood that in order to escape the cycle of financial instability, he had to rise above the ordinary. His journey to wealth began in his college years. Unlike his peers, who spent their free time enjoying youth, Edward worked tirelessly. He took up multiple jobs, invested in small businesses, and studied market trends. By the time he graduated, he had already built a small company dealing in technology solutions. His ability to foresee industry shifts and his relentless ambition helped his company grow. Within a decade, Marshall Enterprises was born, a business empire that spanned across real estate, finance, and technology. With every success, Edward became more ruthless. He believed that emotions were a weakness, and in the corporate world, there was no room for weakness. His company thrived on aggressive takeovers, cutting costs and maximizing profits at any cost. Employees feared him, competitors envied him, and investors respected him. He was a billionaire by the age of 40, but his achievements came at a cost. He had no real relationships, no close friends, and no family to share his victories with. Edward's daily routine was meticulously planned. His mornings started with high-level meetings, followed by negotiations, and ending with reviewing market reports late into the night. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the city, but rarely took the time to admire the view. To him, every day was about getting ahead, making the right moves, and ensuring his business empire remained untouchable. Despite his wealth, Edward was never satisfied. The more he achieved, the more he wanted. He surrounded himself with luxury, designer suits, rare cars, and extravagant properties, but none of it brought him happiness. He was known for his cold demeanor, always calculating and never letting emotions interfere with decisions. If an employee failed to meet expectations, they were replaced without hesitation. If a competitor showed signs of weakness, he exploited it. In his world, there was no space for compassion. Public perception of Edward was divided. Some admired his brilliance and discipline, while others saw him as heartless and greedy. Media outlets followed his every move, portraying him as the man who had conquered the business world, but lost his humanity in the process. His success story was one of determination and strategy, but beneath it lay a man who had sacrificed personal connections for power. Despite the isolation, Edward never questioned his choices. He believed that wealth and control were the ultimate measures of success. He rarely looked back at his past, never allowed nostalgia to slow him down. His parents had passed away before he reached the peak of his career, and he had never taken the time to build a family of his own. Relationships, in his eyes, were distractions. Then came the day that changed everything. The day when an 8-year-old girl risked her life to save his. A moment so powerful that it shattered the carefully built walls around his heart. Edward had never needed help from anyone, yet here he was, alive because of a child who had nothing to gain from saving him. The man who once controlled everything found himself at the mercy of fate. For the first time in his life, Edward felt something unfamiliar, an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. As he watched the unconscious girl in the hospital, his mind kept repeating the same question. Why did she do it? That question marked the beginning of a journey that neither Edward nor the world could have anticipated. In a small, quiet neighborhood far from the towering skyscrapers of the city, an 8-year-old girl named Lily Thompson lived in a tiny but cozy house with her grandmother, Margaret. Their home was old, with creaky wooden floors and paint that had started to peel, but it was filled with warmth and love. Unlike Edward Marshall, who had the world at his feet, Lily had barely anything to call her own, except for a heart that knew nothing but kindness. Lily had never known the comfort of wealth. Her parents had passed away when she was just a baby, leaving her in the care of her grandmother. Margaret, a retired schoolteacher, did her best to provide for her granddaughter, but their life was a constant struggle. Their income came from Margaret's small pension and the odd job she did around the neighborhood, sewing, tutoring, and sometimes baking for the local store. It was never enough, but Lily never complained. Despite their hardships, Lily was always smiling. She believed that happiness wasn't about having everything. It was about finding joy in the little things. While other kids played with expensive toys, she played with stray kittens in the alleyway. While others had fancy school supplies, she carefully saved her old pencils, making them last as long as possible. And while others dreamed of vacations and theme parks, she dreamed of becoming a doctor, of helping people who couldn't afford a treatment. Her days were simple but filled with purpose. Every morning, she woke up early to help her grandmother with chores before heading to school. She loved learning, especially science, because she believed that one day knowledge would be her way out of poverty. After school, she would visit the small bookstore down the street, where the kind owner, Mr. Dawson, allowed her to read books for free. She would sit there for hours, losing herself in stories of doctors saving lives, imagining herself in their place. But what made Lily truly special was her selflessness. She would share her lunch with classmates who had none, even if it meant going hungry herself. She would spend her weekends helping the elderly carry groceries or feeding stray dogs with whatever scraps she could find. She never asked for anything. In return, the people in her neighborhood adored her, calling her the little angel. Yet beneath her cheerful nature, there were struggles she never spoke about. She knew her grandmother worried about money. She noticed when their meals got smaller, when the electricity bill was overdue, when her school shoes had holes in them. But she never let her grandmother see her worry. Instead, she would hug her and say, "We'll be okay, Grandma. Things will get better." She never could have imagined that one ordinary day her life would change forever, that in a single moment she would step into the path of fate, unknowingly saving a man who had everything she never had, and that the simple act of saving a stranger would lead to a journey that the entire world would one day remember. The streets of the city were alive with their usual chaos, cars honking, pedestrians rushing, and vendors calling out their prices. Among the countless faces in the crowd, two people were moving in completely different worlds, unaware that fate was about to collide them in the most unexpected way. Edward Marshall, the billionaire businessman, walked with purpose, his mind occupied with the numbers flashing in his head, his schedule packed with meetings and deals. On the other side of the street, an 8-year-old girl, Lily Thompson, stood near a roadside stall, clutching a small packet of biscuits she had bought. With her carefully saved coins, Edward had no time for distractions. He checked his watch impatiently as he stepped onto the crosswalk, his sleek black car parked just across the street, waiting to take him to his next appointment. The world around him was just noise, meaningless, insignificant. He had long since trained himself to ignore the people and the chaos, focusing only on what mattered, his next move. Lily, however, was in no rush. She loved watching people, their expressions, their stories hidden behind hurried steps. She smiled as she handed a biscuit to a stray puppy near her feet. The little dog wagged its tail happily, and Lily giggled, feeling a warm sense of joy. But then, as she looked up, her heart stopped. A truck. It was coming fast. Too fast. The driver had lost control, the massive vehicle swerving wildly, tires screeching against the pavement. The honking horns and gasps of pedestrians filled the air, but no one moved. The crowd froze, paralyzed by shock. The truck was heading straight for the crosswalk, straight for the man in the dark grey suit, who was too absorbed in his thoughts to notice the danger approaching. Lily didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She dropped her biscuits, her small feet springing into action, her tiny frame pushed through the stunned crowd, darting onto the street. People shouted, but their voices were distant. Her heart pounded as she ran toward the businessman, who was still unaware of the looming danger. Edward took one more step before he felt something, a sudden force, a small pair of hands pressing against him. Time seemed to slow. He barely had a second to register what was happening before he was shoved to the side. He stumbled, falling onto the pavement just as the massive truck roared past. A deafening crash echoed through the street, metal screeching as the truck swerved and skidded to a stop. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then came the screams. Edward sat up, dazed, his heart pounding against his chest. His mind struggled to piece together what had just happened. Then his eyes found her, Lily. She lay on the pavement, motionless, her small frame barely noticeable among the chaos. The little girl who had just saved his life was now lying there, her biscuits scattered beside her, the puppy whimpering near her feet. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had pushed him. She had saved him, and now... "No," he whispered. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He scrambled forward, reaching out, his hands shaking as he carefully lifted her. "Somebody call an ambulance," he shouted, his voice filled with an urgency he had never felt before. The people around him moved into action. Some dialed emergency services. Others stood in stunned silence, watching as the billionaire, one of the richest men in the country, held a small, injured girl in his arms. Edward looked down at Lily's face, her eyes closed, her breaths shallow. Blood stained the side of her forehead, a small wound just above her eyebrow. She looked so fragile, so small. He felt something deep inside him shift, an unfamiliar, heavy feeling pressing against his chest. She had risked everything to save him, and now, as he held her in his arms, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. Edward Marshall had faced financial crises, ruthless competitors, and billion-dollar deals that could make or break his empire. But nothing had ever shaken him like this moment. The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens wailing through the crowded streets. Paramedics rushed out, carefully taking Lily from Edward's arms and placing her onto a stretcher. He stood there watching, his hands still trembling, his heartbeat refusing to slow down. "Are you a relative?" one of the paramedics asked. Edward opened his mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't her relative, he didn't even know her name, and yet something inside him screamed that he couldn't walk away. "I'm coming with her," he said, his voice firm. The paramedic hesitated but nodded. Edward climbed into the ambulance, his mind racing. The doors shut, and the vehicle sped toward the hospital. As Edward looked at Lily lying on the stretcher, his heart clenched. He had spent his entire life controlling everything, his business, his success, his emotions. But in this moment he felt powerless, and for the first time he found himself praying for a little girl he had never met before today, but who had just changed his life forever. The ambulance raced through the streets, its siren cutting through the city's noise. Inside, Edward sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the unconscious little girl lying on the stretcher. Lily's breathing was faint, her small chest rising and falling slowly. Her forehead was wrapped in a bandage, and her tiny hands rested limply at her sides. Edward had seen countless emergencies in his corporate career, financial collapses, hostile takeovers, lawsuits that threatened billions, but none had ever made his heart pound like this. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital, the doors burst open, and the paramedics rushed Lily inside. Edward followed, his long strides, hurried but hesitant. He wasn't family. He wasn't even a friend. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. He watched as doctors and nurses moved quickly, wheeling Lily into the emergency room, their voices urgent. Head trauma, possible internal injuries, prep for CT scan. The words hit Edward like a hammer, but there was nothing he could do except wait. He stood outside the emergency room, running a hand through his hair. His mind was filled with one overwhelming thought. This was my fault. If he had been paying attention, if he hadn't been lost in his own world, this wouldn't have happened. A little girl had almost died because of him. The weight of that realization settled in his chest like a stone. For the first time in his life, Edward Marshall, the man who never let emotions interfere with business, felt something foreign and unbearable. Guilt, a frail voice, interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, are you the one who brought her in?" Edward turned to see an elderly woman, her eyes filled with worry. She looked exhausted, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. It took him a second to realize who she was. Lily's grandmother. "Yes," Edward said, his voice quieter than he expected. Margaret Thompson stepped closer, searching his face as if trying to understand. Is she going to be okay?" Edward wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise her that the little girl who had risked everything to save him would be fine, but he didn't know. And the uncertainty made his chest tighten. "They're doing everything they can," he finally said. Margaret nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She didn't ask who he was or why he was here. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she whispered, "She's all I have." Edward swallowed hard. He had spent his life making decisions that affected thousands of employees. But in this moment, standing before a grandmother who had just revealed her deepest fear, he felt helpless. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, removing his gloves. Edward and Margaret stood up at the same time. "She's stable," the doctor said. "She had a minor concussion, but we didn't find any severe internal injuries. She'll need rest, but she's going to be okay." Relief washed over Edward like a tidal wave. He didn't realize he had been holding his breath until now. Margaret clutched her chest. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded, and together they stepped into the hospital room. Lily lay there, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. Her small frame looked even smaller against the white hospital sheets. Edward hesitated at the doorway, feeling like an intruder. Margaret sat beside Lily's bed, brushing a hand over her granddaughter's forehead. "My brave little girl," she whispered. Edward stood in silence, watching the scene unfold. He had spent his life believing money could solve everything. But standing in that hospital room, seeing the love between grandmother and granddaughter, he realized how wrong he had been. This was wealth. This was what truly mattered. As he turned to leave, Margaret's voice stopped him. "Why are you here?" she asked gently. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't sure himself. He only knew that he couldn't walk away from Lily. He owed her more than just his life. Edward sat in the quiet hospital room, watching the little girl who had saved his life. Machines beeped softly, and the faint scent of antiseptic filled the air. Lily lay motionless, her tiny body wrapped in hospital sheets, a bandage covering the wound on her forehead. He had spent the last few days in this chair, unable to focus on anything else. His empire, his meetings, his deals, all of it seemed distant, unimportant. For the first time in years, Edward Marshall had no control over a situation. He had built a life on power, on the ability to influence outcomes, but here, in this sterile room, he was just a man waiting, powerless, vulnerable. He had paid for the best doctors, demanded the best care, but none of his wealth could erase the guilt sitting heavy on his chest. His mind kept replaying the accident over and over. The moment she had rushed forward, the way she had pushed him out of harm's way without thinking twice, the way she had fallen. Why? Why would a little girl, a complete stranger, risk her life for him? He had spent his whole life believing that people only acted in their own interest, that kindness was just another form of weakness. But Lily had shattered that belief in a single second. She had proven that there was still goodness in the world, pure, uncalculated goodness. Margaret, Lily's grandmother, sat on the other side of the bed, her wrinkled hands resting over Lily's. She was exhausted, worry lining her face. Edward had learned about their struggles, about how they barely made ends meet, how Lily often skipped meals just to make sure her grandmother ate. It made no sense to him. How could someone who had so little give so much? Why did she do it? Edward finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, filled with something unfamiliar. Pain. Margaret looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "Because that's who she is," she said softly. "Lily doesn't think about what she might lose. She only thinks about what she can give." Edward felt something tighten in his throat. He had spent decades chasing money, believing that success was measured in numbers. But sitting here in this hospital room, he realized how empty that belief was. As the days passed, Edward stayed by Lily's side, waiting for her to wake up. When she finally did, blinking up at him with tired but bright eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. "You're awake," he said, his voice unsteady. Lily smiled weakly. "Are you okay?" she asked. Edward blinked, caught off guard. She was the one lying in a hospital bed, yet she was asking about him. His throat tightened, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. That was the moment everything changed. Edward didn't return to his business empire right away. Instead, he spent time with Lily and her grandmother, learning about their struggles. He watched Lily's kindness in action, how she greeted every nurse with a smile, how she comforted other patients despite her own pain. He started questioning everything, his decisions, his beliefs, his entire way of life. For years, he had looked down on people who prioritized emotions over logic. But Lily, with nothing to her name, had shown him more strength than anyone he had ever met. One evening, as he sat outside the hospital, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he made a decision, one that would change not just his life, but the lives of many. Edward Marshall, the ruthless businessman, was about to do something he had never done before. He was going to give back. News spreads fast in the digital age, but some stories have the power to capture the world's attention like wildfire. Within hours of the accident, headlines exploded. Across every major news outlet, billionaire Edward Marshall, saved by little girl, an unbelievable act of heroism. 8-year-old risks her life for business tycoon. Who is she? Edward Marshall's mysterious guardian angel, public, demands answers. Television screens, social media platforms, and newspapers were flooded with the shocking footage of the accident. A shaky cell phone recording, captured by a bystander, showed the exact moment Lily sprinted toward Edward, pushing him out of harm's way just before the truck sped past. The clip was played over and over again, shared by millions, stirring a wave of emotions worldwide. People were moved by the courage of the little girl who had nothing but still risked everything. Comments flooded online forums and news pages. She's an angel. She didn't even think about herself. She just acted. Where is she now? Someone needs to help her. Edward Marshall should do something big for this girl. She saved his life. While some saw it as an inspiring act of selflessness, others turned the attention toward Edward. Public debates erupted, questioning whether the billionaire would truly acknowledge the girl who had saved him or simply move on as if nothing had happened. The media wasn't going to let that happen. Paparazzi camped outside the hospital, eager for any information. Reporters tried to dig into Lily's background, discovering her modest life with her grandmother. Soon, new headlines emerged. The little girl who saved a billionaire lives in poverty. Meet Lily Thompson, the heroine the world can't stop talking about. Meanwhile, Edward remained silent. He had spent the last few days in the hospital, watching over Lily as she recovered. He had never been one to care about public opinion, but for the first time, the weight of the world's eyes was on him. Would he step up? Would he give back? Then, speculation took a different turn. Some critics began questioning Edward's motives. What if he's just using this moment for PR? We all know how ruthless Edward Marshall is. Is this just a way to clean up his reputation? The billionaire, who had spent his entire life being untouchable, suddenly found himself in an unfamiliar position. No business deal, no amount of wealth, no corporate strategy could control the narrative of this story. The only thing that mattered now was what he would do next. But Edward wasn't concerned about the media. He wasn't thinking about public perception. As he sat beside Lily's hospital bed, watching her small chest rise and fall with each breath, he knew one thing for certain. This little girl had changed something inside him, and whether the world believed him or not, he was going to prove that her kindness would not go unanswered. Edward Marshall had spent his life making decisions that shaped industries, built empires, and determined the fates of thousands of employees. But the decision he was about to make now felt more significant than all of them combined. Sitting in the hospital room, watching Lily as she recovered, he realized he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't simply thank her and go back to his world of business meetings and billion-dollar deals. This little girl had risked everything for him without expecting anything in return. And that single act had shaken something deep inside him, something he hadn't even known was missing. He thought back to his childhood, to the struggles his family had faced, to the moments when he had promised himself that money would be the answer to everything. But what if he had been wrong? What if money wasn't the solution, but rather the way to create solutions for others? One evening, as he sat beside Margaret in the hospital waiting room, he turned to her with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "I want to help Lily," he said. "Not just with her hospital bills, with her future." Margaret looked at him carefully. "She doesn't need charity, Mr. Marshall. She needs people who believe in her." Edward nodded. "Then let me be one of those people." The next day, he made the announcement. Edward Marshall one of the wealthiest men in the country, would be setting up a foundation in Lily's name, a foundation that would provide education, healthcare, and opportunities for underprivileged children. It wasn't just a donation, it was a commitment, a new purpose. The media erupted. Some people were skeptical. They thought it was a publicity stunt, a way for Edward to clean up his ruthless reputation. Others were inspired, calling it a transformation unlike anything they had seen before. But Edward didn't care about public opinion. For the first time in his life, he wasn't doing something for profit or power. He was doing it because it felt right. As Lily grew stronger, Edward made another decision, one even more shocking than the first. He didn't just want to support her from a distance. He wanted to be part of her life. When he brought up the idea of adoption, Margaret was speechless. She had raised Lily with all the love she had, but she knew her years were limited. She wanted Lily to have a future, a chance to chase her dreams. And deep down, she could see that Edward truly cared. One afternoon, as Lily sat in her hospital bed, coloring in a small notebook, Edward sat beside her. "How would you feel," he asked gently, "if I told you I wanted to help take care of you, to make sure you get everything you need?" Lily looked up at him with big, thoughtful eyes. "Like a dad?" she asked. Edward felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected her to say it so easily, to trust him so completely. "Yeah," he whispered, "like a dad." And in that moment, Edward Marshall, the man who once thought he had everything, realized he was only just beginning to understand what true wealth really meant. The world watched in disbelief as the news broke. Edward Marshall, the billionaire tycoon, had just made the most unexpected move of his life. Not only had he announced a foundation in Lily's name, but he had also declared that he was stepping away from the aggressive business world that had once defined him. And the most shocking part, he was donating half of his fortune to charitable causes. The headlines were everywhere. From ruthless CEO to philanthropist, Edward Marshall's unbelievable transformation. A little girl's act of kindness. Changes a billionaire forever. Edward Marshall walks away from power. What's next? The media speculated endlessly. Some experts claimed it was a strategic move, a calculated shift to repair his legacy. Others believed it was a publicity stunt that would fade in time. But those who knew Edward closely, his business partners, his employees, saw something different. This wasn't just a public gesture. Something inside him had truly changed. Edward, once a man who controlled entire industries with his iron will, now found himself walking through the halls of schools he was funding, visiting hospitals, where sick children were receiving free treatment under his foundation's name. And every time he saw a child smile, he felt something deeper than any business success had ever given him. But despite the growing admiration, there were critics. Why walk away from something he built from the ground up? He's throwing away power, influence, and control. No billionaire just gives away their fortune like this. What's his real angle? Edward ignored the noise. He had spent his entire life chasing wealth, only to realize that real success wasn't in numbers, it was in impact. He didn't need to prove anything to the world. He only needed to keep a promise. A few months later, at the grand opening of the Lily Thompson Foundation for Children, Edward stood on stage in front of thousands. Reporters, government officials, families, and children who would directly benefit from the programs he had created. Standing next to him was Lily, now fully recovered, holding his hand as she looked up at him with admiration. When it was his turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. "I have spent my life believing that success was about control, about power, about wealth," Edward began. "But I was wrong. True success is measured by what we give, not what we take. And it took an 8-year-old girl to teach me that." Lily squeezed his hand, her small fingers wrapped around his. "The moment Lily saved my life, I realized that I had spent years chasing the wrong things. She had nothing, yet she gave everything without a second thought. That kind of generosity, that kind of courage, is what we should all strive for." And that is why I am standing here today, making sure that no child like Lily ever has to struggle again." The audience erupted in applause. Some wiped away tears, others simply stood in stunned silence, unable to believe the transformation of the man they had once known as ruthless and unshakable. In the months that followed, Edward's impact continued to grow. His foundation built hospitals, schools, orphanages, places of hope. His business empire, once feared for its merciless competition, was restructured to operate ethically, prioritizing fair wages and community support. And through it all, Lily remained by his side. One evening, as they walked through the park, Lily looked up at him with curiosity. "Are you happy?" she asked. Edward smiled, a genuine, deep smile, the kind he had never known before. "For the first time in my life," he said, "I really am, because in the end it wasn't money that had made him rich. It was a little girl with a big heart who had given him something far greater than wealth, a second chance at life." Time passed, but the story of Edward Marshall and Lily Thompson continued to inspire millions. What had started as a shocking event, a little girl saving a billionaire from an accident, had turned into something far greater. It had become a symbol of kindness, second chances, and the power of one small act to change the world. Edward's life had transformed completely. The man who once spent his days obsessing over stock prices and corporate takeovers now spent his time building schools, funding hospitals, and ensuring that underprivileged children had access to education and healthcare. He no longer sought power or control. Instead, he found joy in creating opportunities for those who needed them most. Lily, too, was growing. With Edward and her grandmother by her side, she was no longer the little girl who barely had enough to eat. She had access to the best education, resources, and support, yet she remained the same at heart, kind, selfless, and full of dreams. And her biggest dream had never changed. She still wanted to be a doctor. One day, as Edward walked into Lily's room, he found her sitting at her desk, flipping through a medical book much too advanced for an 8-year-old. She looked up, smiling. "Did you know that the heart beats over 100,000 times a day?" she said excitedly. Edward chuckled, sitting beside her. "That's a lot," he admitted, "but I think yours might beat even more because of how big your heart is." Lily giggled, then looked serious. "One day, I'm going to help people just like you helped me." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. "Lily," he said gently, "you're the one who helped me first." As the years went by, Edward continued his work, and Lily continued to grow into a bright young girl, excelling in school and never forgetting where she came from. She often visited the hospitals her foundation had built, speaking to children who were just like she once was, full of dreams but lacking resources. One day, she and Edward stood in front of a new hospital wing named the Lily Thompson Pediatric Center. As they looked up at the sign, Lily turned to Edward. "Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of me?" she asked softly. Edward knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lily, they would be more than proud. They would be amazed." She smiled, but then she surprised him with a question. "What about your parents? Would they be proud of you?" Edward hadn't thought about that in a long time. His parents had passed away before he became the billionaire he once was, before he built his empire. But they had also never seen the man he had become now, the one standing beside this little girl, dedicating his life to something more than just money. "I'd like to think so," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope they'd see that I finally understand what really matters." Lily reached for his hand, squeezing it. "I think they would be." At that moment, Edward realized something. His past, his mistakes, his greed, his cold-hearted pursuit of wealth, none of it defined him anymore. What defined him was what he chose to do now, the lives he chose to impact, the kindness he chose to spread. And in the eyes of the world, the once ruthless billionaire was no longer just a businessman. He was a father, a mentor, a man redeemed, And all because one little girl had shown him the true meaning of wealth, the power of a kind heart. Thanks for listening to the story. If you've been through something similar, share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to watch the story, she was kicked out of her own wedding. But when she returned, 5 years later, click on right. If you want to watch the story, how a homeless man enters a restaurant and is insulted the next day, he returns in a limousine, click on left.